Alright, so before we actually start making music in Ableton Live, let's go ahead and go through our preferences and make sure those are all set up properly. Now you can access your preferences with the keyboard shortcut using either Command or Control if you're on a PC, plus the comma key. So now that we have our preferences pulled up, you can see it's just made up of a bunch of different tabs here. So let's start from the top and work our way through them. In the Look and Feel tab, you can select the language that you would like Live to display. You can also restore any warnings that you have previously disabled. Let's go ahead and do that for this tutorial. Next, we have Follow Behavior options, which refer to how the cursor moves along the arrangement view. So with our follow behavior set to page, if we go ahead and zoom in here and select this clip to play, watch the cursor as it leaves the screen. A new page will appear to display the length of the cursor. Now if we set this to scroll and we hit play again, we are kept in the middle of the screen. Now all of this will only happen so long as your follow button is enabled here in the transport controls. So if we turn that off, no changes will be made and our screen will be left alone even when the cursor leaves. Moving on, we have the Hide Labels option, and this is most prevalent in the session view. So if we go ahead and select to Hide Labels, some of the labels here, such as drop files and devices, as well as the outputs and input options, will be hidden. Allow Sleep Mode, if enabled, will actually allow your computer to sleep based on your system settings. With this option disabled, Live will keep your computer running so long as it is open. The Allow Multiple Instances option gives you the ability to have multiple instances of Ableton Live running on a single computer. Permanent Scrub Areas refers to the arrangement view. Let's go ahead and turn these on and navigate back into the arrangement view. Above the timeline, you can see I can click anywhere and have a little scrub icon that will play back from where I click. If we were to turn this off, that icon is no longer there. However, we are still able to access the scrub function by holding the Shift key. The pen tablet mode is meant to make life a little bit easier if you're using something like a touch screen or some kind of pen to control Ableton Live. The Enable High DPI mode is self-explanatory and will just give you a higher DPI while in Live. Take note that some plugins or third-party devices may not display correctly when this mode is enabled. The Zoom Display option allows us to zoom Live in proportionately so that we can get a better view of what's going on. I personally like mine around 130%. Next, we have a section devoted to track and clip colors. We can choose to auto-assign the track colors, which will choose something randomly, or we can select a default color from this large palette here. I personally like mine randomized, and then we have the option of how we want the clip color displayed. We can have it match the track color, or we can have it randomized. The Reduced Automatic Colors option will use a slightly reduced color palette when making its selections randomly. This is helpful to avoid similar colors, and especially helpful for those who are colorblind. Next, in the Customization section, we can select a theme to work with. I like mid-dark. We can adjust the brightness of our theme. I like mine at around 150. We can also adjust the color intensity to change the color, and the hue to get even more crazy results. Finally, we have an option to adjust the grid line intensity. And if you take a look in our arrangement view here, as I adjust this number, the grid lines become less and less obvious until they're no longer there. Now let's take a look at the Audio tab. Here in the Audio tab, we can select the driver that we want to work with. If you're using a Windows computer, I would recommend looking into ASIO drivers. If you're on Mac, then you should be fine with Core Audio. Next, we can select our audio device or our audio interface. I have my Focusrite audio interface selected, and then we can configure the inputs and outputs. Here we can rename and enable the different inputs we have available. So I know that this one is my microphone, and the next one is my guitar. I won't be using these in stereo mode, so we can go ahead and leave that unselected. We'll hit OK, and now our inputs are actually named. So if I go ahead and make an audio track here, select external in, here we have 1 microphone and 2 guitar. We can do the same thing for our audio interface's outputs. Here I know that I'm using my HS5 monitors, so we'll just write HS5. Now, depending on what kind of audio interface you're using, you may have an option to enter your hardware setup. Here, I can change the sample rate and the buffer size of my audio interface. So now let's talk about sample rate. I like to think of sample rate very similar to frames per second in video. It's basically the same thing. It's how many times a second we're actually capturing samples of audio when we are recording. A good standard for CD is 44.100. Personally, I like to use 48,000 because we're in a more digital age. The default sample rate and pitch conversion option refers to the algorithm that is being used to convert analog to digital and vice versa. I would recommend keeping this setting always to high quality. If there is a problem that comes from this, we can always adjust that later. Next, we have the latency section where we can set our buffer size. I can go to hardware setup and set the buffer size here. Here we can see the input and output latencies independently, and then their overall here at the bottom. The driver error compensation is useful if your audio drivers or interfaces are reporting any inconsistencies or offset. Here you can account for those. Now, we briefly touched on buffer size, but to give you the bigger picture, every time we record an audio signal, we are recording it through analog equipment, and then when it gets to our audio interface and into our computer, it's recorded digitally. So some kind of conversion is happening there. The buffer size refers to the amount of time that you're giving your computer to make that conversion. So when you're recording audio, you want to use a really low buffer size so that there's not much offset, delay, or latency that will occur. Now, when you're mixing or mastering, you can use a lot higher of a buffer size because you don't really care about that latency. You're still going to hear the signal correctly, but it doesn't matter if there's a bit of latency when you're just hitting the play button to hear a section. However, when you're recording, it's a different story. So keep that in mind. We'll definitely come back to this tab when we talk about the test tone in the next video and we set the proper preferences for our specific computers. Not all computers are made equally, so you've really got to find the settings that work properly for yours. So we'll be coming back to the test tone to do just that. But for now, let's move on to the link, tempo, and MIDI section. So let's start with the link feature. Link is an ability of Ableton Live to sync up with different apps and devices over the Android and Apple Store that actually lets you sync up Ableton Live and control it from said devices. We can choose to show the link toggle here in the transport bar, and we can also enable link to control Ableton's start and stop options, and that's with this option here. Personally, I don't use link, so I'll choose to hide that. Next, we have the tempo follower feature, which is a new feature to Ableton Live 11. Again, just like link, we can hide or show the follower toggle in the transport bar. The next option allows you to choose an input channel where audio will be sent, and Ableton will try its best to follow the tempo of that audio as long as the follow option is engaged. And now let's move on to our MIDI options. So our first section here correlates to control surfaces. There are many different control surfaces that are supported by Ableton Live and allow you to essentially control the entire software. Currently, I have a Push 2 and an APC40 hooked up that we'll be using throughout these video courses. Here you would set the input and the output. The input allows the MIDI controllers to send messages, and the output allows MIDI controllers to receive messages. So if there are lights or indicators or even sometimes motorized faders, you will need to have the output selected to get these tools to work properly. The next option allows us to select a takeover mode, and this refers to how Live will respond to different knobs, faders, or controls being moved on our MIDI controllers. The options we have are none, pickup, and value scaling. With no takeover mode selected, you may have very unexpected results when you try to control Live's parameters from a MIDI controller. With pickup selected as your takeover mode, Live's parameters will only start to change once your MIDI controller matches the parameter in Ableton Live. However, with value scaling selected, Live will start to change its parameters as soon as you move a knob or fader. It instead will make adjustments proportionately based on whether you're moving it up or down. Next, we have MIDI ports, which correspond to any MIDI controllers that can't be identified as a control surface. So you can see we have ports for the input of controllers and ports for the output of controllers. Now, if you expand the ins or the outs, you can have more control over the MIDI clock. If you're having syncing issues, this is where you would want to go to adjust those. However, we're going to focus on track, sync, remote, and MPE. So the track option should be enabled if you want MIDI notes and parameter changes to be sent between the inputs and outputs of controllers. So we'll turn it on for our APC40 because we definitely want that to happen. The sync option is best for tempo syncing devices. So these are mostly synths and drum machines that allow messages between live and real hardware with tempo information to occur. The remote option actually allows you to map Ableton parameters to MIDI controllers to be controlled directly from the hardware. And lastly, the MPE option enables MIDI polyphonic note expression for specific MIDI controllers that support MPE. And there are really a lot of cool things that you can do with MPE, especially in the MIDI editor, so look forward to exploring that further. For now, let's move on to the File Folder tab. Starting from the top, we have the option to create analysis files. Now, when you have this option selected, every time you select an audio or MIDI file from your browser, Live will create an additional accompaniment file that stores different information based on the audio or MIDI resource that you selected. Next, we have the option to select an external sample editor from our computer. And when you have a sample editor connected here in the preferences, you will be able to launch that sample editor directly from the clip view of any audio file. Next, we have the option to change the location of our temporary folder, and your temporary folder in Ableton Live is basically a folder of recordings. Anytime a live set has recordings in it and the live set hasn't been saved itself, recordings will be stored in this temporary folder, and then once you save the set, they'll be moved into the actual project. Next, we can select a different version of Max for Live to work with. I personally use the Ableton Live bundled version of Max for Live, but you may have a separate version with more features or that you're more comfortable with, and you can navigate to that here. Lastly, we have options for the decoding cache, and the decoding cache in Ableton is basically Ableton's desire to work with uncompressed files. So if you load something like an MP3 into Ableton, that's a compressed file, and Live is going to do its best to uncompress that file and then store the original compressed file in the decoding cache. So here we can select the minimum amount of free space and the maximum size we're allowing this cache to get to. We can even clean it up here if we click that button, and we can choose the location at which the cache is stored. So now let's move on to our library tab to deal with a few more file locations. First of all, we have the option to collect files on export, and I choose to leave this always. What this means is every time you export a track or even a clip for that matter, Live will collect any files that were used in the process of making that clip or track and collect them into the project. Now, ideally, what you want to do is go to File, Collect All and Save, and that will basically do the same thing. However, sometimes you forget to do this, and Live will reference different clips that are outside the current project. And so if you were to send your project to a friend, Live would have some missing files. Now we're going to look deeper into that problem in the file management section. For now, just consider that it is something that you need to keep in mind and be attentive to when you're creating in Ableton Live. The next option can be enabled to actually show any Ableton Live packs that you can download right in the browser. And then you can actually download them directly from the browser without ever having to go to the Ableton website or work out how you're going to get them into Ableton Live. The next section refers to content locations. So first off, we can select the location of our user library, and I like to keep my user library in a cloud basically, and then connect to it from each computer. So I always browse to my cloud files once I'm synced up, and then I always have the same user library no matter what rig I'm working at. The next option is all about our Ableton Live packs. And if you decide to download them directly from the browser, you can select the folder in which they are downloaded here. And it also says get more packs at ableton.com. So be sure and go check out all the packs that they have. They have some great stuff, and you can really get a leg up in your production. Anyway, now let's move on to the plugins tab. So first we have the option to rescan for plugins, and this is something that you're going to want to do if you decide to change the location of your plugin custom folders or things like that. Maybe you downloaded a new plugin, simply hit rescan. Live will look through all of your folders and add any plugins to the browser that it can find. So we can use a VST2 custom folder, and what this means is that you can save plugins to a specific folder on your computer, and then you can browse for that custom folder, and Live will load up all the plugins that you have downloaded. You can also choose to use VST3 plugin folders and custom folders. Last, we have options for how plugin windows respond within Live. So first of all, we can allow multiple plugins at the same time. We can also choose to automatically hide plugins. So if we click on something else, then that plugin will be hidden until you again select the track that you're working on. And you can choose to auto open plugins. So anytime you load a plugin onto an audio or MIDI track, then that plugin will open automatically. So that's all for the plugins. Now let's move on to the record, warp, and launch tab. So first we have some options with recording. We can choose the type of file we want to use. I personally recommend using WAV, and then we can choose the bit depth all the way up to 32. 16 is the standard for CDs, but I like to use 24. And the bit depth basically just refers to the dynamic range of recordings. So it's the difference from the loudest thing recordable to the quietest thing that's recordable that will actually be picked up in a recording, if that makes sense. So just keep in mind that sample rate and bit depth kind of go hand in hand. Right now I'm using a sample rate of 48,000 with a bit depth of 24. Both of these parameters can be used to explain the quality of a recording. Next, we have our recording count in, which we can set here. The exclusive option refers to ARM and solo buttons, and you can have one, both, or none selected for exclusivity. And basically what this means is so we have exclusive ARM and solo on, so we'll go ahead and show you. I arm this track, and I try to arm this track, but it will not let me arm it because this one already is. However, if we turn this off, we go ahead and try to arm another track, we can arm all three if we want. Now you can always get around the way that this behaves by simply holding Command or Control. So right now we have exclusive solo on, but I'm going to hold Control, and now I can solo multiple things at once. And it works the same way. If solo was set to be non-exclusive, we're going to solo a bunch of these, and then we're going to Control click on this, and now we're using exclusive solo. The next option we have is the clip update rate, and this basically refers to how clips will be displayed when they're being recorded, say from the session view. If you change a parameter on that clip, Live will take copies of the clip based on the update rate. So for me right now, every eighth note, Live will take a copy and update the clip. The record session automation button is relatively self-explanatory. Basically, you can choose to record automation while in the session view on only ARM tracks or all tracks. So if it were set to all tracks, a track would not have to be armed. You could change a parameter, and that will be recorded in as automation. Next, we have start playback with record, and so if this were on and we hit the record button, playback would start. However, I like to leave mine off so that I can toggle recording without starting the whole show. Next, we have some options for automatic warping and fades. The first option refers to the looping and warping of short samples. So I have mine set up so that every time I load in a short sample, I get an unwarped one shot. Now, alternatively, you can have this as a warped one shot, a warped loop, or just have Live automatically choose the best case scenario. Personally, this one fits my workflow best. Next, we have an option for long samples. We can choose to have Live automatically warp these samples. I personally like to do this by hand, so I have mine set to off as well. Next, we can choose a default warp mode from the 5 different warp engines available, and we can also choose to create fades on clip edges automatically. Now let's move on to the launch section. So in the session view, we have different clips that can be created, and we can launch them here on these cells, right? We can create new scenes with new cells and keep on clip launching. So this is what all these options refer to. First of all, we can select the default launch mode, and keep in mind that this option, the launch mode option, can be changed for each individual clip. The same thing goes for launch quantization. I personally set mine to match the global quantization so that I can change all of them in one go here in the transport bar, but you can alternatively select a specific measurement if that's going to work best for you. The select on launch option, if enabled, will select a specific clip when it is launched. The select next scene on launch will do the same thing. However, it will select the next scene. So scenes are up here and they represent an entire row of clips. So when you have an entire row of clips, you have a scene. And so with this select next scene on launch, we can simply launch a scene and then have the next scene selected and ready to go. The start recording on scene launch option will start a recording in any ARM tracks once a scene is launched. If a clip already resides in the corresponding cell, then no recording will occur. However, take a look here at this piano track. We have this piano track armed and ready to go. So if we start a scene, you can see that a recording is launched. The next option will start playback with tap tempo. So basically, if you tap out a tempo, Live will automatically start playback. Our last option here refers to MIDI note drawing with pitch lock. We're going to go ahead and create this MIDI clip here. And currently, pitch lock is on, right? So I'll enable draw mode and I'll start drawing around. See how I'm going up and down and only notes on this key are being drawn? Let's turn this off and now I can go freehand. Now, just like the exclusive option, we can always bypass our pitch lock option here. So right now, I'm in freehand, right? I can go up and down, but I'm going to go ahead and hold the Alt key. Now, I have pitch lock on. Same thing, we're going to turn this off. Now pitch lock is on by default. I can't move up and down. Hold Alt, and I can move up and down. So you can always bypass these settings. So that's it for the Record, Warp, and Launch tab. Now let's take a look at the Licenses and Maintenance tab. Here you can select to get automatic updates. I choose to always get automatic updates, and we can send usage data to the developers at Ableton. I'm going to go ahead and leave this setting on to help them out as best I can. And if you haven't already authorized Ableton, you can do that here either with a serial code offline, or you can go straight to ableton.com and log into your account. So that's all for the preferences. I know it's a bit dry, but once we get through these, we'll really be able to start making music in the way we want with our computers set up properly.